Okay, the manual mode is a mode that I use quite often. Actually, I either use the AV mode or the manual mode. And the manual mode is very different from the AV and TV mode because on the manual mode, you decide not only the f-stop, but you also decide the time. You decide both. Now, when do we use manual mode? It says to be used when you need the same exposure on different photos. For example, panoramics, shooting events, creative exposures, difficult light situation. We're going to take one by one. So panoramics, you see here all photos have the same exposure. I want it because I'm going to merge all these photos together, so I need to have them to look exactly the same. So I went into manual mode. I dialed in f8 because I wanted a big depth of field. I determined that 1/200 of a second was fast enough to get because it was during the morning, so there was a lot of light. And all the photos have the same f8 and 1/250 of a second. They have the same exposure and they're going to be very easy to merge together. So that was very handy to use a manual mode. Now, how I determined that 1/250 of a second was fast enough, the way you work is you start off by AV mode, you go to f8, you press the shutter, you take a photo and you see that your photo looks good. And you look at the speed, and the speed was 1/250 per second. So then I went into the manual mode. I dialed in f8. I dialed in 1/250 of a second because I knew I would get a proper exposure, and I took these 5 photos. Same exposure on all 5. This is another example, shooting events. When you shoot an event, this was an event I shot, and it was like a lot of different light situation, and I wanted all the photos to kind of look the same. So same thing. I went into AV mode at f4. Which was the largest I could go actually with the lens I was using at the time. And I went to 1/60 of a second. 1/60 of a second, I pressed the shutter speed and I saw that, the 1/60 of a second would give me a proper exposure. So I dialed that into my camera, f4 and 1/60 of a second. So wherever I was walking into the event, I had the same exposure on all the photos, and it made them like pretty uniform for the night. And the customer was pretty happy. Another example, creative exposures. This was a scene when I was shooting straight into the sun, and that's the exposure that the camera was giving me. That was the AV mode version of it. I put in 7.1 because that's the usual value I use to have a sharp landscape. And as I was in AV mode, the camera tells me, well, I'm fine at 1/2000 of a second. I took the shot and I wanted to see if I could go darker. So I went into manual mode and I dialed in f7.1, but I forced in 1/8000 of a second. So, it was a lot faster, so a lot less light came into the camera and it got darker. So I kind of didn't like that, so I tried the opposite. I dialed in 1/500 of a second and got a much lighter exposure. So that was a creative exposure. Now, this was a difficult light situation also. I was trying to make this portrait in the middle of the night, so I forced in my camera to be at 1/50 of a second, and you will see an example later on this specific photo, 1/50 of a second at f4. So whenever I was shooting, I had to go to 1600 ISO to get a proper exposure. But whenever I was shooting, I took like dozens of photos of that gentleman. All of them were sharp because all of them was at 1/50 of a second, f4, 1600 ISO. And if I was not in a manual mode and if I was in AV mode, most of the time, because there's a lot of light change, if I point the camera a bit here to the right, it's brighter than to the left, the speed would have changed all the time and would have gone too slow most of the time, even at 1600 ISO. And a lot of my photos would have been blurry. So that was great. I could get all my photos sharp because I was in manual mode and I forced in the 1/50 of a second, I forced in f4, and I forced in 1600 ISO. But there's a specific video later on that specific photo.